You remember the subprime mortgage crisis? When the global economy was crashed by some people in America making loans to buy houses a little too easy to get? That was pretty crazy. One decision in one country led to the biggest economic crisis since the Great Depression. And a little while before then, there was the dot-com bubble. Companies overhyped what new internet and computing technologies would allow them to achieve, and again, investors gave out too much money and eventually the market crashed. The dot-com bubble made venture capital firms extremely cautious, and investment didn't reach pre-bubble levels until 15 years later. If you've kept up with financial or economic news at all in the last 2 decades, you're probably familiar with those two examples. But did you know that there were many other bubbles in history, some with impacts rivaling those recent ones? We'll start with one you've all likely heard of, tulip mania. Tulip mania started around 1634, during a quieter period of the 30 Years' War. Tulips had first reached Europe around 100 years prior and quickly became popular among the upper class. Tulips are relatively easy to transport and plant since they sprout from bulbs rather than needing to transport seeds or a whole plant. They're also easier to care for than the alternatives for colorful flowers available at the time, such as orchids or azaleas. Tulips especially caught on in northwestern Europe, and the United Provinces of the Netherlands became one of the largest importers and producers of the flower. Dutch plant breeders created many new varieties and crossbreeds of tulips, driving up demand. This was also around the time when the first markets resembling futures markets began to crop up. These were forward markets, which were much less formal than what we have now. On forward markets, you would come to an agreement about a potential future delivery of a product, but firm contracts were usually not signed, and there was no standardized way to go about this. But some became indexes, where you could speculate on if the index would go up or down. People kept guessing that the numbers would go up, because that's what would be beneficial for them. Others saw the prices of tulip bulbs exploding and quickly jumped on the bandwagon. By 1636, the prices of both common tulip bulbs and rare varieties had increased dramatically, and was growing exponentially by the end of the year. Keep in mind, this was the 17th century. Trading wasn't happening using computers, phones, or even ticker tape, just in-person physical trading. But by February of the next year, prices had completely collapsed. By May, the prices had returned to their pre-bubble levels. This was still very high, I will add. There were still fortunes to be found in tulips. The amount of people completely bankrupted by the tulip trend was much smaller than is popularly reported. Yes, there were those who sold their homes for a few tulip bulbs, but those were outliers and not the norm. The prices did reach insane heights. It's difficult to measure the exact price, since there was no standardized exchange, and there aren't many good surviving records. Here's a short list of things you could allegedly trade one tulip bulb for. A half-ton of wine, 5,000 pounds of wheat, 12 sheep, a bed, and one person even traded 12 acres of land and a house for a tulip bulb. The exact causes of tulip mania are still debated, but it was likely caused by similar economic circumstances to the dot-com bubble and housing bubble. The era was a good time for the Netherlands, having somewhat recently gained independence from Spain. People were optimistic, and investors were willing to spend. Combine it with a niche luxury good that people assume the value of can only go up, and you have a bubble. Next, another plant-based bubble. Pteridomania wasn't a fad about dinosaurs, but rather ferns. Understandable, ferns are cool. This was much less of a mania than tulip mania, but a notable bubble nonetheless. Pteridomania lasted from approximately the 1830s to 1890s and was localized to Britain and Australia. This was a time when sciences like botany had become much more accessible to the average person, and it just so happened that amateur botanists in Britain really loved the fern. Ferns are abundant in Britain, but were one of the least studied plant species of the time. Gardens with flowers and the like were already very common by this time, but ferns were infrequent additions. Their unique shapes and patterns made them a popular choice for art and decoration, and collecting ferns quickly became a fashionable hobby. Everything from stained glass windows to wallpaper to wood and cloth could be found with fern patterns stenciled on. Ferns swiftly had become a major industry, so much so that native species of ferns in Britain were almost driven to extinction by hordes of collectors. While ferns themselves did have a spike in price, it wasn't nearly as drastic as with tulips. The fern industry absolutely did become a bubble, however. A good chunk of botanists in Britain spent their time writing about and researching ferns. The British government spent large amounts of money to build ferneries, essentially indoor gardens just for ferns. When the trend finally died out, it led to a total collapse of one of the British Empire's bigger businesses. There were other trends like mania, but those were much shorter lived and involved plants that were actually exotic, like cacti or pineapples. This next one has some debate around it as if it could truly be considered a bubble, but I'd say it was. Copper is a big industry, and of course it has a futures market. One of the biggest is the London Metals Exchange. A company that was heavily involved in trading on the LME was the Sumitomo Corporation in Japan. Sumitomo is just a trading company. They don't do anything except make trades all day. One of these traders was a man named Yasuo Hamanaka, who began dealing with copper in 1985. Hamanaka soon lost around $60 million by making bad copper trades in the Philippines, but he felt he couldn't report this loss to his bosses. He was able to successfully hide his losses by forging documents and burning real ones, leading to his promotion to Sumitomo's top copper trader in 1986. Hamanaka had to figure out a way to recoup his losses, and in his mind, the best way of doing this was straight up monopolizing the global copper market. He began working with a company in Britain called RST Resources, and quickly became their biggest client. His plan of controlling the global copper supply fell through, but he did earn the nickname Mr. 5%, because he did own 5% of the world's copper at one point. So with his copper dream shattered, he went to go look for the silver lining. He still owned a bunch of warehouses filled with copper in Zambia, and had a contract with a copper mining company in the country. He started selling off the copper in storage, rebuying it, and logging it only as a profit. Naturally, he was caught a few years later, since it's fairly obvious when 2 million metric tons of copper go missing. Global copper prices immediately crashed when the scandal broke, wiping out many small traders and mining companies. Hamanaka would end up costing Sumitomo over $2.7 billion in losses with his illegal trades. He was sentenced to 8 years in prison for his crimes, and thankfully the system was fixed and nothing like this ever happened again. These are just a few of the many financial bubbles throughout history. Economies are strange places, so maybe think twice when someone asks you to buy into their new cryptocurrency, or invest in a company with a mission statement as long as your arm.
You have reached the 651 area code test number in St. Paul, Minnesota for the Minneapolis LATA 628.